Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us at this Kopi Talk on the literary pioneers of Aokang, organized by World Scientific Publishing. Before we start, here are a few housekeeping rules to follow throughout the webinar. Please, at all times, turn off your camera and keep yourself on mute. Please also direct any questions for the Q&A session in the chat. And this session will also be recorded and shared onto our social media pages. So please feel free to pop by our Facebook page if you would like to rewatch the webinar again or share it with your friends. Last but not least, My Father's Kampung is available for purchase on our website if you're interested. And without further ado, I will be handing over to Shawn, who will kickstart this Kopi Talk. Shawn, please.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. Okay, so let me just click on this. All right. Okay, I will start. Thank you everyone for taking the time to attend the talk today. I appreciate it very much. Also, a very big thank you to Robert Yeo, Eric Valles, and World Scientific for this e-launch. I greatly appreciate Robert's care, mentorship, and guidance in particular. He provided not just the foreword for the book, he also shared his stories with me. Robert is a literary pioneer from Aokang and actually pointed me to the stories of Teo Kah Leng and Teo Poh Leng, the two Teo brothers of Aokang, which ultimately culminated in the theme of this talk. We'll be sharing more about these pioneering people later. But first, I will be briefly introducing my new book, My Father's Kampung, supported by the National Heritage Board. I'll keep my sharing informal and as engaging as I possibly can. And then after that, I'll invite Robert and Eric to share, and we can take questions at the end and have a dialogue if time permits. As the name suggests, this book is about my father's kampung, when it was still known as Aokang in Teochew, before it transformed into Aokang in Mandarin. This book is about my journey as a son in appreciating the life my father experienced and understanding the history of the place that he called his home. My father Simon was born at Lorong Laukun in Aokang in the northeast part of Singapore. In other words, Aokang was my father's kampung. Aokang broadly refers to the stretch of Upper Serangoon from the 5th milestone up to the 7th milestone called Kangka, which does not exist today. What constitutes the location or the actual area of Aokang itself can be quite controversial. It varies according to the person you ask and the particular time period. For example, Kangka, a historic fishing village, was part of Aokang in the past, but it's not part of Aokang today. Parts of Kangka are now in Sengkang. In the 1950s and 1960s, the political constituency was even called Punggol instead of Aokang. In the 1955 state assembly elections, the electoral division called Punggol Tampines also covered Aokang, then part of Punggol. So the definition we are using to tell our tale is, Aokang refers to the stretch of Upper Serangoon from the 5th milestone intersection of Upper Paya Lebar and Upper Serangoon Road up to the 7th milestone called Kangka. It also includes the whole of Punggol. My father Simon, my uncles and aunties, and their friends and neighbors all grew up in this area. In fact, my father attended Montfort School when it was still called Holy Innocents English School. He later served as an educator in both Montfort Junior School and Montfort Secondary. Over the years, my father also came to live at other places in Aokang, such as Jalan Payolai, Jalan Lai Kui, and Lorong Buangkok for about 30 years before he moved out of Aokang in 1975. Recently, there's been great interest in this area. I'm not saying this just because of my book, My Father's Kampung, A History of Aokang and Punggol. I'm also saying this because the National Heritage Board released a heritage trail, which was covered extensively in the media. Also, recently, Mothership covered academic Brian Goh's 2018 article on Teochew Catholics in Aokang, following a recent vandalism case. Clearly, this northeast part of Singapore is intriguing and worth writing about. Why is this the case? So to me, among the many other reasons, this northeast part of Singapore is interesting because Teochews are not the dominant Chinese dialect group in Singapore. Hokkiens are. There are around 2 Hokkiens for every 1 Teochew, thereabouts. In the same way, Catholicism is not the dominant religion in Singapore. Buddhism and Taoism are around half thereabouts. Yet Aokang used to be a Teochew-dominated area with many Catholic Teochews. Teochews and Aokang were either the majority of the Chinese or disproportionate to their overall size in Singapore. For example, in 1986, the Straits Times reported that more than 90% of the villagers were Teochews in areas like Kangkah. The Teochew dialect there was the lingua franca. Everyone spoke Teochew, even people from other dialect groups or races. Also, according to the 1957 census, more than 56,000 Teochews lived in the administrative area of Serangoon district. Now, Serangoon district was actually a much larger area covering Serangoon, Punggol, Paya Lebar, and Seletar as well. But what's important is that this district had the largest concentration of Teochews outside the city of Singapore, where more than 140,000 Teochews resided. Significantly, when the figures are compared to the size of the total Chinese population residing in that area, Serangoon district had the highest proportion of Teochews in the whole of Singapore. Even earlier in 1891, when the rural population was much smaller, more than 55% of the 900 Chinese in Division 1, covering northeastern Singapore, including areas like Aokang, Punggol, Kangkah, they were Teochews. And among these Teochews in Aokang, there were many Catholics. Academic and Aokang resident Brian Goh used a 1973 parish census and calculated that around 7 in 10 of the area's residents had a distinct Catholic Teochew communal identity. Recently, I was also having a chat with one of the Montfort alumni, and he mentioned casually to me that his non-Catholic classmates, including himself, attended Mass at the Church of the Nativity. He also said that his Malay teachers, one of his Malay teachers also attended Mass. So clearly it was also a social thing. The main church at the heart of Aokang was the Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which actually started as a much smaller chapel in 1853, St. Mary's Chapel. But the area also had other churches, the Church of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which started as a chapel in 1953 between the 5th and 6th milestones of Upper Serangoon, and St. Anne's Church in Punggol since 1963. So the question arises, right? Why were there so many Catholic Teochews in Aokang? I think that this was because of the large role Catholic missionaries played in the education of children in Aokang and the Christian schooling they brought to Singapore. So simply put, Catholic Teochews arrived in Aokang in its early days, around mid-1800s. A church was formed to serve their needs, and several schools were established by the church, and a virtuous cycle of Catholic Teochew practices and behaviors arose. Even foreign missionaries in Aokang could speak Teochew, often learning it in Romanized form so that they could communicate with the locals. Catholic Teochew migrants from China periodically came to the area and some settled down. This was especially in the late 1920s when there were troubles in China and also what was termed a Red or Bolshevik Revolution against the Catholics. In my previous talk, I actually focused on the church and the Montfort School, but today we're covering a slightly different theme. Today's theme is on the literary pioneers of Aokang, and the three main pioneers we'll be talking about today are Robert Yeo, Teo Poh Leng, and Teo Kah Leng. Some fans had asked me in my previous talk why I didn't cover Serangoon English School. Well, to correct this, I have with me today my mentor, one of Serangoon English School's most prominent alumni, Robert. Robert will share more about his personal stories later. Instead, first I'd like to set the context and share more about the two Teo brothers who were poets, Teo Kah Leng and Teo Poh Leng. Many of the prominent alumni of Holy Innocents English School and Montfort School were residents of Aokang. But when I was researching for my book, one name from Montfort stood out for me, and that's poet number 1. Catholic Teochew Benedict Teo Kah Leng, born 1909, was an Aokang resident and pupil of the former Holy Innocents English School. He later served Montfort as a teacher and became principal from 1927 to 1969. He actually wrote the lyrics for the school song, Song of the Brave. In 1959, when Holy Innocents English School was renamed Montfort School, Teo became the principal of its primary section, remaining in the post till 1964. I understand that he was a well-beloved man. He was one of Singapore's pioneer poets, along with his brother, Paul Teo Poh Leng, born 1912. Unfortunately, his older brother, Peter Teo, and Paul, the youngest, were killed by the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. Teo Kah Leng only fortunately escaped because he was visiting a friend elsewhere. He later wrote about his grief in a poem, I Found a Bone, published in the school magazine. His prose and poetry were published, especially during the 1950s and the 1960s, up till his retirement, with 26 poems appearing in Young Malayans and Montfort Annual. Teo's writing style reflected that of a dedicated and thoughtful teacher-poet who saw pedagogical value in reading and writing poetry. He believed that poetry could teach pupils basics about English skills, including pronunciation and important values in life. Teo Kah Leng was also a devout Catholic. He attended Mass daily, he sang in the choir at special occasions, and even served occasionally as lector and warden at Sunday Masses. Teo Kah Leng served in Catholic organizations such as the St. Vincent de Paul and St. Joseph's Dying Aid Association. The association, also known as the Lim Zhong Hui, or literally Nearing the End Society, was originally founded in 1924 by devout parishioners and officially inaugurated in 1926 with Holy Innocents Chinese Boys School as its office, Father Becheras as its first spiritual director, and Go Lai Kiam as its first elected president. It aimed to spiritually and financially support the dying and their families. Teo was a member and served as a trustee for the St. Joseph's Dying Aid Association. Many Catholic teochews were members of the association, even my Aunt Florence. My Aunt Florence is the vice president of this association. And this association often conducted Catholic prayers in Teochew. So clearly, Teo was an exemplary Montfortian dedicated to faith and education. Now I'll go on to poet number 2, and it gets a little bit more exciting here, I promise. Poet number 2, born in 1912, Teo Kah Leng's brother, Teo Poh Leng, was the youngest sibling. He was a primary school teacher but wrote poems under the pseudonym Francis Eng. And why did he choose this particular pseudonym? And Teo, his niece and daughter of Teo Kah Leng, said that Francis was in fact Teo Poh Leng's Catholic middle name, and Ng was his mother's maiden surname. Teo Poh Leng lost his life to the Japanese during Suk Ching. Many of Singapore's talents perished during the war. He tragically lost his life shortly after he had written F.M.S.R, a poem about a train journey from Singapore to KL on the Federated Malay States Railways, inspired by T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. Published in 1937 by Arthur Henry Stockwell of London, the poem received good reviews from luminaries at the time, such as British poet Sylvia Townsend Warner and Cornish poet Ronald Bottrell. Part of F.M.S.R actually came out in the 1937 issue of British Literary Magazine and Life and Letters Today. Teo Poh Leng wrote way before Edwin Thumboo, long recognized as one of Singapore's literary pioneers, arrived on the scene. Unfortunately, during the war, Stockwell's offices were bombed, leaving only a handful of copies of Teo's work in the world after his death. He would actually have been lost to history had it not been for a Japanese. So now I'm going to share a quick story of a professor pursuing the case of a missing poet. In what is probably the only case of a transnational literary detective story centered around a poet from Aokang, I think I can say with confidence, this is the only case of a transnational literary detective story centered around a poet from Aokang. Japanese scholar Dr. Ojihara Shuk, who taught American studies and Japanese at Dortmund in Germany, flew over to Singapore to pursue her investigation into the case of a missing poet who had disappeared. This missing poet she was looking for was actually none other than Francis Eng, in other words, Teo Poh Leng. The Straits Times picked up Dr. Ojihara Shuk's story and reported on it. Readers got in touch, a collaboration was formed, and Finding Francis, a poetic adventure, a book on this transnational literary detective story, was published in October 2015. I'm actually quite grateful to have this to help out in my research because it really helped the book quite a bit. But I found it strangely ironic how a Japanese researcher eventually found what the Japanese military had hidden away. And now enough hearing from me. I know you came to listen to Robert and Eric. I will now introduce the next two guest speakers very briefly and then hand over the time to them. Robert himself, a literary icon from Aokang, he needs little introduction. He will share about his personal stories and the influences behind his plays and poems. Did Aokang have anything to do with it? Did Serangoon English School have anything to do with it? I'm sure he has a lot of interesting stories to share with you today. Eric, the director of Poetry Festival Singapore, he's an expert in the field of poetry and he will read the poignant poem, I Found a Bone, and will share his views on it. He will also read The Old Boatman and The Flute in a Bamboo Grove. After that, we will welcome questions and have a conversation. So thank you very much for your kind attention. And now I'm going to pass the time over to Robert. Robert, please.
I have to click on my square to appear on the screen. Am I right?
I think World Scientific will help you with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for including me in your program, Shawn, and for the generous introduction. I'm Robert Yeo, and I use the name Robert Yeo to acknowledge the fact that I write in English. My Chinese name is Cheng Chuan, which means, I think, clear stream. In the forward to Shawn's wonderful book, I said that I spent the first 26 years of my life in Aokang, in number 5 Valley Road. In 1966, sorry, I was born in 1940. In 1966, I went to the UK to pursue studies in education for my master's. My contribution to this program is to read from my memoirs, my autobiography called Roots, a Singaporean memoir 1940 to 1975, which was published in 2011. I spent 8 years, not necessarily all the time, writing this memoir, and it ends in 1975 because I feel that I want to go on to write Roots 2, which will take me to the year 2000. In writing this book, and I think it is a rather indulgent book, a longish book, nearly 400 pages with about 100 illustrations, I must say that I have been indulgent. Indulgent in the sense that my publisher was prepared to publish a longish book of nearly 400 pages. Why is it so long? Let me explain my method in writing this autobiography. I use what I would call the ripple effect. That is to say, I start in the middle of the ripple with self, meaning myself, which would include ancestry, and ripple out to the community if you draw a circle which ripples out, and then from community to nation, and from nation to the rest of the world. I saw myself as a witness to events that shaped me, and hopefully, in the second part of my memoirs from 1976 to year 2000, to things that I did, which might have shaped the lives of some of my students or some of my contemporaries. But enough of that. I'm going to now read two excerpts from Roots, and the first excerpt concerns my life as a primary and secondary school boy. It's from chapter 4 of the book, and it's called 1952 to 1956 Rock Around the Clock. The transition from primary to secondary school was not as traumatic then as it is now. There was no dreaded primary school leaving examination to sit for, no second language worry, no extra private tuition, no parental paranoia. I continued my secondary education in the same school. From Form 1 to 4 years, at the end of which I sat for the Cambridge O-level exams. Two subjects harried me, maths and Chinese. Maths was essential, but the policy for learning what was then referred to as vernacular languages was ad hoc. I was either very bad at maths or the teachers were bad, more likely the first. Because I was good at the other subjects, I was promoted. But by the time I came to study for the O-level exams in late 1956, I realized that my mathematical knowledge did not go beyond that of the end of Form 2. I taught myself to make up for 4 years of maths confusion and ignorance by going back to the basics of division, trigonometry, and algebra, and secured a credit for it in the O-level examinations. For me, it was an astounding achievement. The same could not be said for my performance in Chinese. The same pattern as maths repeated itself. We spoke Baba Malay and English at home. We professed a Hokkien identity but did not speak it, although we had a teochew helper called Sim. Chinese meant Mandarin, and the script was absolutely alien. Tone in the language was unlike what it is in English, on which I had spent years. I had no chance to practice it at home. There was zero support, no campaigns, no Chinese newspaper or radio. It must have been in Form 3 that my equally helpless classmates and I were to take the end of year examination. Our teacher, Mr. Yao, bespectacled, frustrated at our lack of progress. There were Indian students too, as Tamil was not offered, sat the paper and invigilated. I looked at the paper and despaired. I could not even read the instructions, let alone do what the paper required. I looked around and the same desperation was reflected back in the faces of my classmates. We looked up at Mr. Yao imploringly, but he was or appeared impassive. The majority of us returned to our numbness. Many of us had not even mastered the basics of Form 1 Chinese. We looked at each other and started to groan. Some of us make signs of opening up our desks to reach out for our Chinese books. Some of us knew what we were doing. Mr. Yao responded by shaking his head. We moaned again. Mr. Yao shook his head, pointed to the room where the principal had his office and said, "No, boys, this is an examination. You must keep quiet. The principal's office is nearby." We were unmoved. We made a unified groan which was impossible to ignore. Finally, Mr. Yao relented and said, "Okay, boys, you may cheat." We took out our text and made some headway deciphering the instructions. But the passages down to sentence and paragraph we were unable to read. Promotion to the next level, despite our not being able to master what the year's work at that level required, rendered us uncomprehending and ignorant. I failed my Chinese. So did many of my classmates. We cheated and failed. We were allowed to cheat but fail. That year, I was allowed to drop Chinese. I will end my first excerpt there, a traumatic event about my failure to learn Chinese. Over to you, Shawn.
Thanks, Robert. Actually, you can also share about the other aspects of roots. You had several elements about not just your school, about inspiring principle, I believe,
Yes.
and even the principle with a revolver. You can raise that. Those
Yeah.
are
You,
things
you
that
want me
people
to
would be
go
interested.
on to the next excerpt
Yeah.
then?
Why don't you? Yeah. Why don't you just read the excerpts? I think people will be very interested to hear
Okay,
those.
all right. This one is a little
ahead.
more inspiring about a principal who took over for about 6 months from the long-term principal, Mr. S.C. Ting, because I think he went on leave, and Mr. N.I. Lau took over the school and changed the character of the school completely. Here is an excerpt, and this is how it goes. We did not have a school song, but we had a school motto. It was play the game. The sentence came from a poem by Sir Henry Newbold, 1862 1938, who published many volumes of patriotic ballads and lyrics. The British Marxist critic Terry Eagleton writes, "It is no accident that the author of one of the most influential government reports in this area, the teaching of English in England, was none other than Sir Henry Newbold, minor jingoist poet and perpetrator of the immortal line, play up, and play the game." N.I. Lau gave us our school song. Lau Nyong Ng came into our school in 1953 when I was in Form 3 to fill in for the principal, Mr. S.C. Ting, who was on leave. Mr. Lau stayed for less than a year, 4 months in fact, but during that period, he transformed the school. He was, I was to learn later, an anti-colonialist at a time when the majority of teachers just stopped because it was a profession. Teaching was a means of imparting knowledge that was relatively mutual. If knowledge was power, so be it. Power to get a certificate, a job, and so on. The fact that we were still a British colony was was an acceptable but can't help it hard fact. Among the Anglophile friends, there was not a whiff of ideology. The tumult that affected the Chinese middle schools did not at all affect the English language government school, which observed the birthdays of the English king, George VI, and after his death, with his daughter's ascension to the throne, Queen Elizabeth II, we continued to sing God Save the King, but changed King to Queen, the tune and the rest of the lyrics remaining unchanged. Empire Day was observed by listening to messages from the King or Queen on radio, relayed the next day, as well as messages from the Governor of Singapore and the Director of Education. Elizabeth II's birthday was celebrated, and we all learned to sing God Save the Queen. God save our precious Queen. Long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen. Mr. Lau did not try to change by removing these rituals. He knew well the ways of empire. What he did try to change, however, was our sense of history, which the history teacher, Mr. A. Kanesan, was not able to do. He taught history as British Empire, doggedly following our two textbooks, G.W. Southgate, The British Empire and Commonwealth, and another book by Williamson, the title of which I cannot remember. According to their scheme of things, the British lost America and Tipu Sultan was a villain. Robert Clive was the great hero, and Warren Hastings an ambiguous figure. N.I. Lau was the first person to mention Mahatma Gandhi. He talked enthusiastically about Gandhi's non-violent struggle to win independence for India. He said vividly, do not point a finger at anybody. For one finger you point, three fingers will point back at you. He was an environmentalist ahead of his time. He exhorted against littering in school and showed the way by picking up things discarded in the school and throwing them in specially provided bins. Above all, he gave us a school song using a convenient tune very likely taken from a hymn. He wrote the lyrics which we memorize. His energy and motivation made it easy for us. At assembly and on occasions which did not clash with imperial commemorations, we sang. You boys of the Serangoon School, can we on you now call to do your duty in the home, in school by one and all? All love to give, all hate to let. We are to give, not grab. Let others hum and haw, who cares? We are to do, not blab. Chorus. You can depend on us. You can depend on us. Never shall we fail our school, our own Serangoon School. I will end there. And I allow was absolutely inspiring. Over to you, Shawn.
Thank you for sharing that, Robert. Yes, so okay. Uh, I think that was quite a nice sharing because NI Lao not only showed you guys that there was a way to, counter colonialism in a very subtle and subversive manner. He also inspired you to, in a way, have a sense. Seems to me that he inspired you to have a sense that we have our own identity and history, and that we are not really a British colony, that it was in the last throes of colonialism. So I think that was a nice sharing. But Robert, why don't you actually just read out all the sections that you had? I think people would be interested to know not what I have to think on it, but the parts about how Serangoon English School affected your writing. Were there any teachers that inspired you? Well, you shared that the principal inspired you, but were there any inspiring teachers or any girls perhaps? Huh?
Well, no, there was an inspiring poem. When I was in secondary three, one day I was walking to school. I walked to school every day, and to the right of Florence Road, there were a couple of bungalow houses, and for some inexplicable reason, I think it was occupied by an Indian family. They had books to sell,
Oh,
and I stopped by one day. I can't remember morning or afternoon to pick up a book which is about the size of a pocket diary. And that book was actually a pocket version of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in the translation by Edward Fitzgerald. And I went home and I read that particular poem, and it inspired me for some reason or other. I think maybe because it had the kind of philosophy which says you must make best use of time. Time is flying. Carpe diem.
mm,
Make the most of your life. And when I read the poem, it took wings and it inspired me to want to write poems, to be able to write a poem like the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam.
mm,
And yes, one other inspirational thing occurred to me. For some inexplicable reason, an additional subject was added to the curriculum called additional literature. In other words, in addition to the literature as a subject at O level, another paper was added called additional literature, and included stunning poems that started with the Augustan poems, John Dryden, Alexander Pope, and went on to the Romantics. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats. And I was inspired by the poems of Wordsworth. And this inspiration continued when I went to St. Andrew's School after my O level and again encountered a romantic poets. So I would say a second influence on my want to write poems was encounters when I was 1956, when I was 16, to the romantic poems, in particular to Wordsworth.
I see.
And I think that was when I decided that I would like to be able to write poems. But I think I'll stop there. Then maybe there might be questions at the end, and I could elaborate on this
Yeah.
inspiring experiences.
Yeah,
Shawn?
I think there might be more questions at the end. But maybe one more point from you, one more sharing from you, and then we can go to Eric. If I'm not wrong, Aokang had one of the rare privileges of having a very well-stocked library. You mentioned before that there was the boys' club. So did the boys' club or the library or the influences of the people there at the community center, did they have anything to do with inspiring you, or no, just table tennis?
No, in the boys' club, I played a lot of table tennis. I was the captain, and we were, at one year, I think we won the top award for table tennis amongst all the community centers. There was a library there, the early precursor of the National Library.
Yes, that's right.
And there was a librarian there called Mr. Pereira. But I don't think his library inspired me because I had begun to collect books from the age of about 14. And in a sense, I had my own library. I don't recall depending on the school library. Oh, yes, I had a friend called Sing Tek. He had a large collection of books, and he would come up to me and say, "Have you read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens? Have you read this? Have you read that?" And I would say to him, "No. Can you lend them to me?" And he lent them to me, and then I became a bookworm. So there was another influential.
Okay. Thank you very much for that sharing. So, okay, so, well, you've heard Robert share a bit about his early days in Aokang. You heard him talk about his school principal that inspired him, a librarian, table tennis. You even heard Robert sing. So now we'll change tack a bit and we'll go on to Eric Valles. And Eric is going to read for us a few poems. And these poems were written by Teo Kah Leng. And what would be nice would be he's also going to give us a critical analysis of this so that, we can better understand this better. Eric is an expert in poetry, so I think we can pass the time to him and he can take it away. Eric, please.
All right, thank you very much, Shawn and Robert. I'm an avid reader of poetry. I'm not really an expert in any way, but I've also been intrigued by the writings of the Teo brothers, and I have some notes about these works. But my sharing will be like a mirror image of Shawn's comments earlier. He started off with Teo Kah Leng, and then he went on to Teo Poh Leng. Now, let me just begin my thoughts on these poems with Francis Teo Poh Leng, right? With his Federated Malay States Railway, and it's also a big shame if we're not gonna listen to an excerpt from F.M.S.R. So maybe later on, I'm gonna read one section from it. Depending on how much time we have, right? So the Federated Malay States Railway poem is probably Singapore's first modernist long poem. And even before it was forgotten, it had an unusual fragmented history. It was published in England by Francis Ng, that's his pen name, and Shawn explained how he got that earlier. He was a school teacher and a poet. And it was a compliment to Teo when his publisher, Arthur Stockwell, wrote in his publication 101 Markets for Poems that was released in 1937, an attack on poets who expect any short verses, usually hastily scribbled on the backs of envelopes to sell. And he praised people like Francis Teo Poh Leng, um, who take their verses seriously. Right, and then so F.M.S.R is made up of 10 parts. It's a long poem. It's a detailed poetic observation of a 9-hour journey from Singapore to Malaya on the F.M.S.R. That's why the title is that. And it's also about the prevailing inequalities in the Straits settlements during the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So or should I call him or Teo? Denounces the political system of Malaya and the British Empire, as well as the growing corrupting influence which he saw in the transnational economic elites, whom he thinks that these elites are corrupting the native culture. And now let me just read the very first section of F.M.S.R. And this is in reference to those economic elites. Millionaires from the New World with nothing else to do wander the old world like wandering Jews. Call here to buy wooden shoes, pieces of cheap porcelains, costly gewgaws, and Malacca canes. Call here to learn without learning anything new. Some more than once to ride the familiar round, and when they leave nothing follows them but the sound. The emanation of their own unsatisfied craving, their desire uncrowned. Nowadays, and this is the political commentary, monarchy and democracy are mere appellatives for mediocrity. So is the aristocracy of wealth, these millionaires. What numbskulls they must be, who are unawares of their own idiocy. Unwittingly they come, unobserving see the same wares they did leave behind at home, to meet foreign jeers, to see tigers and snakes in Singapore, and drink tiger beers. But our tigers have grown timorous, and dare not come forth to meet the amorous whimsicality of the rich visitor. So to the Punggol Zoo she goes to meet living tigers, snakes, and armadillos, or dead tigers guarding garish advertisement panels, or Raffles Museum to stare at stupid animals. Right, so that's an indictment of all these foreign business people during the Great Depression. So Shawn already mentioned the good reviews of F.M.S.R. And you can learn more about this poem that was rediscovered recently from the book Finding Francis. Can you see? Sorry, can I see? Can you see it? Finding Francis, and the author Eriko Ogihara Shuk happens to be in the audience this afternoon, so we're very privileged to have her, and maybe she can offer her views later on. So not everybody felt awed by F.M.S.R. Philip Holden, who was a critic here, based here for a long time, so he didn't consider F.M.S.R. plumbing deeply enough. So he thought that the poem dwells on petty irritations of Singapore and its surroundings in writing Singapore. All right, so in this poem, Singapore is depicted as a backwater colony, assaulting the senses of the cosmopolitan visitors. It felt more like a third world economy in the 1930s, and was described this way. I'm not going to read that section, but the part about Singapore goes, wafting odors to the nose and dust flying to the face is a sweltering hot and disgusting place. And everywhere about that place float noises. Being another hideous race, humming, droning, ringing, banging, buzzing, drowning, looting, clanging. Babel never heard so many voices, right? So I just think that whereas the main inspiration for FMSR, The Wasteland, bewails the collapse of Western civilization on a grand scale, FMSR meditates on a narrower scale, the disillusionment of a particular people, that of the Chinese diaspora, who endured privations in agrarian Malaya during the Depression. So their desires for riches in this part of the world is but a pipe dream eventually, because of the circumstances of the time, right? And I mentioned that FMSR is the first modernist long poem in Singapore. And the influences of modernism, especially of the wasteland, are quite evident. It's written in irregular stanza forms, mostly free verse, and it is an irregular rhyme scheme. So this contrasts it with the works of his brother, Teo Kah Leng. And the action in FMSR is driven by conflict arising from urbanites or these foreign transnationals escaping the squalid city, Singapore. But in the process, they seemingly desecrate the unsparked landscape of the Malayan countryside. So there's a forward movement of a train with its clangorous engines disturbing the stillness of the landscape. And the engines are perceived as monstrous and inducing a nightmarish trauma in the long poem's dramatic speaker. And FMSR is quite ahead of its time. It explores an ecological theme at a time when people were concerned about buttressing the economy. It showcases the cultural polyphony present in Singapore and in Malaya. If you recall, one verse went, Babel never heard so many voices. And finally, it contrasts the city and the countryside, and ultimately the real and the artificial in a light-hearted manner. So he makes use of onomatopoeia, and there are ironic juxtapositions of details in his work. Okay, but underneath the light-hearted verse in some sections, there are invisible fissures in the landscape as a result of this violent crime-induced trauma. And in his narrating these violent crimes, the Catholic side of Francis Teo Poh Leng comes out. He makes use of religious imagery, specifically the murder of the Holy Innocents in the place of the Christ child and Herod, as well as Pontius Pilate, who ordered Christ's crucifixion. So with this imagery, he provides a mystic depth to the anarchic scene of Malaya under the British in the 1930s. Let me just read that one part of it. It goes, murder at the crossways in the gardens, at 1, at 2, and 3 and 4. I hear, I see, I know. Slaughter on the highways and the byways, massacre of holy innocents, killing fetus in its mother's womb. We have out-Heroded Herod and out-Pilated Pilate, and must reap as we have sown. We will curse and weep our concrete gods unknown. So, yeah, he suggests a collective lack of empathy. And there's an association between them and the perpetrators of Christ's death, right? So he makes use of neologisms, out-Heroded, out-Pilated, to describe the gravity of the injustice during that time. Okay, we're probably running short of time. Let me just comment on I Found a Bone by his brother, Teo Kah Leng. And one, okay, it's a good thing that that last point of FMSR is present in Teo Kah Leng's I Found a Bone, right? So as you know, Francis Teo Poh Leng was rounded up among Chinese citizens And as a teacher, he was killed with his brother Peter, among people suspected of sympathizing with the mainland Chinese cause. And they were intellectuals who were considered as threats to the wartime government. So I Found a Bone is a dramatic poem with a regular rhyme scheme, unlike F.M.S.R. After every alternate line. And like Teo uses Christian imagery for his testimony, and he elicits emotional engagement with imagined discourse from his brother Francis Teo Poh Leng. And do we have time for? We should have time for at least I Found a Bone. Okay. And if you would like to read all the poems of Teo Kah Leng, they're collected in this book. Can you see it? I Found a Bone and Other Poems, published in 2016. Okay, this is I Found a Bone. I found a bone on Punggol Beach, half buried in the sand, and bleached as white by the sea and sun. I picked it with my hand. It was as brittle and as light as coral in the sea. It had been once an arm like mine, and a hope like me. I had a hope, for life is hope. My days were young and fair. I had faith in fellow men. The arm bone did declare. But then there came a fateful day to shatter hope and faith. 'Twas 1942, February 28th. Barbarian hordes had overrun this fair and sunny isle. They herded me and friends of mine like a pack of creatures vile. A futile dream was hope in life and faith in fellow men. We were carted like beasts to Punggol Zoo and never heard of again. They strung us each to each in a line, our hands behind us tied, and stretched us all along the beach to face the rising tide. My brother stood upon my right, a friend he was to all. He leaned a little on my arm and merely whispered, "Paul." He had a wife and children small, 5 altogether told. I was my mother's darling son, and she was blind and old. Where was the other brother of mine? Him too did these brutes take. Good God, keep him from murderous hands, for his and mother's sake. Is this the way of hope and faith? I muttered in my breath. Must guiltless blood be made to ebb in such inglorious death? I am the way of life, your hope. I heard a voice reply, no, I am hanging on a cross, and Calvary is nigh. So that's, I'm sorry, there's one more. A machine gun sputtered a deadly hate. A bullet whizzed through me, and I was dragged down by the line that dropped before the sea. I heard my brother groan and die. I heard approaching feet, and I felt the welcome steel that stopped my heart to beat. I held the arm bone in my hand and let my warm tears fall. My brothers were slain on Punggol Beach. My brothers, Peter and Paul. That's it. Yes. Yeah, back to you, Shawn. And maybe Robert would like to make some comments as well.
Yes, I was very moved by that poem. I think I Found a Bone is one of the most poignant poems I've read. I tear up every time I hear it. And what's interesting I find is that, yes, like you mentioned, there's the use of Christian imagery. So what happened is that when I was doing research for the book, a lot of people did ask me, one of the themes in your book, My Father's Kampung, right, is that there is a Catholic teochew identity in Aokang. And when I was reading the poems like you mentioned, this Christianity does come out as very strongly in it. I noticed they infused it into practically a lot of their poetry. It stands out. Yeah. But the other part that struck me, other than the Catholicism part, was just how terrible and pointless war is. They mentioned Punggol Zoo. So in my book, I also cover Punggol Zoo as well. But what is tragic about Punggol Zoo is that the Japanese military turned it into ammunition dump, so it was a place to store ordnance. And so basically a place that had been full of animals was turned into a place that was supporting killing lives. It's just that tragic. The British also didn't do too well during the war. They asked the owner Basapa, this gentleman, to leave, right? So take your animals and go. For those animals you can't take with you, you have to kill them. And so you got to imagine this guy, building up a zoo for his whole life. He must have loved these animals, and then they had to be killed. So I think this whole thing is a tragedy. I don't know. So when I was hearing your point, I just felt sad throughout. But okay, maybe now instead of us having a conversation among ourselves, what would be really interesting and where most people like to jump in would be to have a chat or a dialogue with us. Doesn't have to be me answering, can be Eric or Robert. So now this is where we open it to the audience. There's a chat function. If you can see, it's over here. And what you do is you key in the questions I'd like to ask. So questions are okay, comments are okay. If you would like to talk about the poems or the literary pioneers, you're of course welcome to do that. That's the theme of this talk. But if you want to talk about Aokang or Serangoon English School, yes, because some of you have nagged me why you never cover Serangoon English School, you can also ask that. Robert will be more than happy to answer, and I can cover the other famous pioneers from Serangoon English School, like Mr. Ng Yo Kang, Nyam Tong Dao, and so on. So if you want to ask on that, that's possible. So just keep it open. It can be a range of questions. So we welcome any questions and comments now. Eric, Robert, okay?
Sure.
Maybe that we will do that. Yeah.
I think you already have a question, right, Shawn, about the Peranakan aspect of.
Yes. So maybe to kick off, we had a question,
Teos,
and
yeah.
this question was on whether F.M.S.R had any Straits Chinese or Peranakan themes. Would you see anything Straits Chinese or Peranakan in it? Okay, so maybe Eric or Robert, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I could start because Robert has an interesting take on this. Francis Teo Poh Leng probably saw himself as overseas Chinese, Hua Chao, or teochew, rather than Straits Chinese. And Straits Chinese as a term or as a category is rather wide, and maybe Robert can talk more about that later. Francis or Teo Poh Leng actually studied Mandarin, and he was also part of some organizations with other Chinese. He studied in SJI, which was an English language school. And he probably conversed in English with his friends. He certainly wrote in English. So he probably saw himself more as teochew or overseas Chinese rather than, strictly speaking, Peranakan. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Robert?
Yeah, I think the word Straits Chinese is a very wide term, and within the Straits Chinese category, the Baba Chinese. What distinguishes the Babas and the female equivalent Nonyas is that they are able to, or their language is Baba Malay, and majority of them are Hokkiens. There are other distinguishing markers of being Baba. That is to say, you like Baba Nyonya food, you speak Baba Malay at home, and you went to an English school, and you would also speak English at home. Mostly they're Hokkien, I think I've said this. And of course, there's a reference to the way that the women folk preferring to wear dresses that is associated with the Baba Chinese, the sarung kebaya and the slippers. So these are the distinguishing markers of the Baba Chinese. I don't think the two brothers would qualify as Baba Chinese. I would say, like Eric said, that they would see themselves as part of street Chinese, and certainly overseas Chinese. There are also Babas who are Teochew and Hainanese, but the majority would be Hokkien. I myself uh, belong to that community of Baba Chinese. I'm described as Hokkien. My first language was Baba Malay. I like Peranakan food. In dress, I'm not particular. So that was the situation. And I would like to invite some comments on this notion of Straits Chinese and Baba Chinese. I stop there, and perhaps we'll have some rejoinders from people.
Yeah, I would like to share on this one. So, okay. So the context of this question is the person asking it is from overseas. So as a result, they may not know the terms and the connotations that are associated. So actually, there are really two questions here. The first question is whether a Peranakan is the same as a Straits Chinese. The second question is whether then does the Teo brothers, and in particular Teo Poh Leng, F.M.S.R reflect that, right? So effectively, there are two questions. I'll address the first one first. I think Peranakan is generally taken to mean locally born. Over the years in Singapore, it's come to take on the connotation that it refers to Baba Nonya, which to me and to many other people, which would be considered a slightly separate group. So Baba Nonya would be more of a particular type of Straits Chinese, but there were other Straits Chinese as well, you know. So basically, I think that's a clarification of the terminology. So the second one, what is the heart of the matter, the nub of it? And I think in the nub of it, the questioner is asking from an overseas point of view, do you think whether this F.M.S.R had any localized Chinese kind of characteristics? And I would say yes. It doesn't have to be F.M.S.R. When you read through Teo's poems in general, they seem pretty localized. I can recognize Raffles in there. I can, and so I would say to address the intent of the question, the answer is yes, there are Straits Chinese Peranakan teams. But in terms of the terminology used, Peranakan is a loaded term, meaning it's not often taken literally as a locally born. It's come to acquire the meaning of Baba Nonya. And what makes it interesting is if you want to broaden the topic further, and this is not just by me, the Peranakan Museum also says that Jawi Peranakan, there are Indian Peranakan, the Indonesian Peranakan, and so on. So what happens is that it can be further expanded. It depends on whether you take an inclusive or an exclusive view. So for some people who are a bit more purist, then Peranakan is a narrower term. Then clearly Teo Poh Leng and Teo Kah Leng are not very Peranakan at all. Even though they speak English, they probably didn't speak Malay at home. As a matter of fact, as I argue in my book, everybody in Aokang spoke teochew. So even if you're Malay, you also speak teochew. You wouldn't. So Baba Malay is rarer there. Robert, you had this experience before, right? Didn't you, Robert? Robert was going up the street one day where he happened to bump into this auntie selling things, right? If I remember the story goes, the auntie told Robert, huh? Teng nang wei ta, teng nang wei, right? Something like that. Well, translated in English, it means what kind of Chinese are you, Robert? Why are you speaking? Why can't you speak Chinese? Chinese here refers to Teochew. So clearly, if you use that logic, since I argue that most people in Aokang spoke Teochew, even Robert spoke Teochew. By the way, Robert claims he doesn't speak Teochew, but his understanding of dialect is way better than mine. So basically, if you go by that reasoning, no, they are not Peranakan strictly speaking. But are they Peranakan in the sense of being locally born Chinese? Yes. Is there starting to develop a distinction between the overseas Chinese and the China Chinese and the Chinese that came here but intended to go home? I will say yes. One of the key themes in my own work, and I see in Robert's work as well, is that over the years we've come to evolve or create. I think create would probably be more accurate, a Singapore identity. So what constitutes this identity exactly? It is found in the writings of local writers, local pioneers, not just Robert, the Teo brothers as well, and many others, Edwin, Thumboo, and so on. It is in the local history. It is in the local heritage, the local, the local poems, the local plays. I would say, if we go by that reasoning, then I would argue that Teo Poh Leng, Teo Kah Leng, these Teo brothers, and Robert, of course, have started to move us in a direction where one day, hopefully, people will not be inspired by Wordsworth. Singaporeans will not be inspired by Wordsworth, but inspired by a local writer instead, or a local poet instead. But that day is still far off, huh? That's just my view.
Okay, if I could just add something,
Sure, go ahead.
this is from the from the reading of Teo Kah Leng. He actually has poems which are told from the point of view of overseas Chinese. The poem that I was planning to read earlier, "The Flute in the Bamboo Grove," is told from the perspective of mainland Chinese in Singapore. Yeah, and it's quite explicit. You can read it in this. I'm sorry, in this book. Yeah, I found a bone in other poems. That's all. And you're talking about teochews, right? And I guess Robert knows that Prof. Edwin Thumboo is half teochew, and he actually
Yes.
talks to people. He talks to people in teochew, like when he goes to market.
Yes.
Yes.
I see a question coming. Maybe we should take that question. Shawn?
Yeah, sure. Okay, before we take that question, let me just address Lucy's comment regarding, won't nag you regarding Serangoon English School. See, I deliver my promises. I remember what people asked me. So I've brought Robert Yeo here, so don't nag me. Yeah, Serangoon English School alumni right here. Okay, this question is for Mr. Robert Yeo. Do you know what Malay you are? I sense that there are few truly Malays in Singapore. Most Malay here are from the Nusantara places like Java, Sulawesi. I came to this webinar halfway, so I don't know if the topic of Orang Laut or Orang Selita was discussed as the original peoples of the area. So Robert, would you like to try to address this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe the questioner wants to know about my reference to Baba Malay.
Yes.
Baba Malay was the language of Chinese who spoke Baba Malay. And in fact, for the first 6 years of my life, that was my first language. And I used it to speak with my mother in particular. When I started going to school at the age of 6, Baba Malay as a first language receded and English took over. I think one important aspect of Babas and Nyonyas in Singapore is that their first language is Baba Malay. Okay, so that is that part of me growing up that we describe as Malay. Another important distinction I want to make, and this particular concept has not entered our discussion, is the notion of the word Malayan. We talk about Chinese who are overseas Chinese. We talk about Straits Chinese. We talk about Chinese born in Malaya and Singapore. Singapore was seen as part of Malaya. And the question of identity that was discussed at that time was not Malaysian, not Singaporean. It was the notion Malayan coming from the word Malaya. And Singapore is seen as part of Malaya. So I think we should bring into our discussion the notion, the notion, the idea of identity suggested by the word Malayan. You remember that there was a magazine that was referred to by Eriko Ogihara Shok in her book about Francis Teo, and a reference to someone, an Englishman called Richard Sidney, who edited an influential magazine, and it was called The Young Malayan. So I think we should, in our discussion, incorporate the notion of identity called Malayan. I'll stop there and see what else we can get from our respondents and from the panel. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yes, so we
Uh,
welcome
maybe-
any questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe Shawn would have more to say about the Malayan identity than I can. Let me just say this, that yeah, Malay as a race is quite broad, and it maybe goes beyond Malaya, historical Malay in itself, because the Filipinos actually consider themselves as Malay, and our national hero, Jose Rizal, who was in Singapore 5 times before he was executed, is considered in the Philippines as the Great Malayan. In fact, so yeah, so Malay or Malayan are quite broad terms, and they go beyond geographical borders. But maybe Shawn has more to say about that.
Oh, I take a slightly different view.
Okay.
So first and foremost, I take the view that any writer often cannot escape the influences of the present. Meaning that when you write in a way, you encapsulate the writing of the present, the influences. And so for me, I take a different view in the sense that it's an evolution or identity. So in the early days, then the identity, so even in the course of my book, my father's Kampung, it roughly covers the period 1800s to 1975 when my father left the Kampung. And so in the early days, we are British colony. Then we start seeing ourselves as Malayan in a way. For a time, we were part of Malaysia. And then after that, we got kicked out or we left, depending on how you argue it or how you see it. And then after that, we became Singaporean. So where I'm coming from is that when we look back in our history, obviously we were well, in a way, kicked around like a football sometimes, in the longer history, even spanning back 700 years. The question is, among them, which aspects can we draw and string together that will help to cohere us or provide us with some ballast as a nation? So what happens is that, ironic as it may seem, although I'm often categorized as a history writer, I think I'll push back against this notion. Some people characterize me as a history writer. I'm not. I'm writing community stories, and where I'm coming from is that these community stories have an arc, right? A narrative arc. And where I see it is, how did we come to be who we are today? The question I really want to ask, or the themes that I develop, are who we are as a people. Where did we come from? How did we get here? And now that we are here, what do we need to do to move forward? So one example of a theme that's Malayan, so to speak, is the question of whether we are better off as a part of Malaysia or not. That means Malacca, Penang, Singapore, street settlements, you are together and all that. I don't address these sort of themes in my book. Robert does it in the roots and all that, and he was an active participant and who lived through these times. But for me, no. I'm more looking and casting my eye back to the past, and I'm seeing it. Was there anything that guides us to where we are, to how we get to this point and what we need to do to go forward? I'm a bit more oriented in that way. My background is in economics, and the history that I did was economic history. So it's actually not even related to the books that I write. But one thing that stood out for me is this thing called the Kampung spirit. Now it matters not whether you are a British colonial subject or a Malayan or a Malaysian or Singaporean. Today, this Kampung spirit, does it exist? Is it useful for us as a country to have that? And so this is where actually I stole some lines from Robert. I'm plagiarizing him right here. I was at a talk with, I think Robert and I were at a talk where Catherine Lim was promoting her new book on ghost stories. This is true story, I believe. It was a book on ghost stories. And then after that, Robert and I happened to catch up, right? And that's when I first heard Robert tell me, Shawn, you're writing local history. You first start out with your family. I think he mentioned it earlier. Then after that, you can broaden it to a community. And then after that, you can broaden it to society. I think Robert might know the words exactly better than I do. But I was quite inspired, and that's when I started writing this book on the larger community, because my father's kampung basically covers a geographical area of Singapore that a few people, actually no one has written on it. This is the first book that's dedicated to it. And my first two forays in writing history were local history. I just wrote about my family. And so now I've expanded. So, to address your question at the start, I don't think about Malayan at all. Malayan is like in the past. What I do is I want to know in the past how we got here. Yes, that's important. Knowing where we came from is important, but we shouldn't be too hung up on whether we are Malayans or Malaysians or whatever. We accept it. They kicked us out. Now we have to move on our own. In a lot of the book in my father's kampung, I cover the idea of progress. I think few would argue that we want to go back to the days of the actual kampung, with chickens running around your house. Although it did evoke a lot of positive memories from a lot of people. They spoke to me about how they loved it. You read about coconut lah, chicken in your house lah, they loved it. Some of them even told me where the hatcheries were located and all that. I can tell you that they had a lot of fond memories of the kampung. But that's not the intent of my book. While it may bring about a nice sense of nostalgia, where I'm coming from is, that nice community spirit we had in the kampung where people helped each other. They had a gotong royong spirit. They helped and trusted one another, that sense of neighborliness. Where's it gone? Guys, where is it now? These are the sort of questions that I want to grapple with. So, yeah. So I'm sorry I don't have a good answer on the Malayan part. I thought it would make more sense to share about what I was trying to do with the book. So the topic of today's talk, right, is on the literary pioneers. I could have selected a whole bunch of other literary pioneers, right? Why did we select these three? Robert Yeo and the two Teo brothers. It's because although they may have at certain points of their life perceived themselves to be Malayans, one of them died a Malayan, but two of them evolved with the times, and I would argue that they are Singapore's heritage. They are Singapore's treasures. In fact, I think Tommy Cole went so far as to call Robert Yeo a Singapore's treasure or some icon or something like that, right? Some very significant phrase, and that is correct. Robert is a Singapore literary pioneer. Yeah, he might have been a British subject at one point of time in his life, but it's not anymore. Yeah. Sorry, I gave a very today answer.
Thank you, Shawn. But there are a couple of questions. Can we take them?
Oh, yes. Okay. So let's go in order. Robert, what do you miss about old Aokang? Okay, yes.
Oh, what we call the Kampung spirit. Several features of it. One, I lived in a bungalow house, and the people in Valley Road, the children that I mingle with, were all my Kampung friends, and we would go and with our fighting fish, and our fighting fishes would challenge one another. We would fly kites together. We would play marbles together. That's one thing. My home, 5 Valley Road, had 3 rambutan trees, and my neighboring friends would come and enjoy the rambutans from our trees. We said, sure, come and enjoy the rambutans. And so the rambutan trees in my house were famous. It became in many ways the rambutan trees of some of the boys and the girls in the kampung. And at one time we had a well, and you remember in those days there was water rationing, and if you had a well, water rationing was not a problem. I want to mention one more thing, Shawn, about your book, your wonderful book. And I think
Thank
I
you.
might have mentioned that my sister, when she read it, thought the book was wonderful, but asked, what about the girls? And I said to Shawn, that might have to be another book, Shawn. So
Yes, a
you've got
sequel, right?
you've got a project there. Yeah. The wonderful girls of CHIJ in Hillside Drive in Methodist
Yes.
Girls' Schools.
Yeah, your sister is absolutely right. I think looking back, we didn't cover enough of the women, so we should do that. Yeah, I'll definitely come and talk to her, so we'll get more interesting material for the next book, a sequel perhaps.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so thank you, Wilson, for that question, and thank you, Robert. There's another question. Apparently, there were numerous tiger attacks in the Aokang area. Shawn, do you have further info on that? Well, yes, Aokang was basically in the rural areas of Singapore. It was very common to have tiger attacks. Admittedly, in the book, I don't cover this. I mention it in a line or two in passing, but most of the time I cover violent attacks. Where do we start? There were pirate attacks. There were uh, robberies and all that. There were even riots. In the 1850s in Singapore, it was a very lawless place back then. There's an old Teochew saying, Lau Aokang Bo Cheng Hu. There's no government in old Aokang. So the no government, you could get eaten by a tiger, you could be assaulted and robbed, you could have a dialect-based riot happening. It was a very violent time. Life was nasty, brutish, and short then. This is a true story. Yeah, but I'm not so sure how it was related to the theme. I thought that was a good point to raise. Yeah, I think Aokang only really became a bit more developed later on. In the 1800s, it was a pretty wild place. Every other newspaper report you have is on something violent or other. So yeah.
There were gangs in Aokang, although.
Oh yes, in the Kanka area, right? Robert,
Yes.
you want to share
No,
more
I
about
don't
it?
know enough about them. I know some people who were members of gangs, but I did not mix with them, and I did not encounter violence. But I did know a couple of friends. One was a neighbor who was a member of a gang. There was another person in who was a member of the community center. He was, I think, Eurasian, and he was heavily tabooed, and it was rumored that he was part of a gang. He wasn't Chinese. I think he was probably Eurasian. So there were sort of physical evidences of gangs down there, although I did not get involved in them at all.
Yeah, that's right. So there were also gangs as well. Yeah. Now that Robert has reminded me, it was once said that Kanka was infested with gangsters, and a lot of people who didn't fall prey to the gangs, they said that it was because of the good influence of the church. Chief among them is a gentleman called Mr. Ng Kok Song, who said that it was the church's guiding ways and how it influenced him on the right path, and that's why he became a good student and later became a successful person rather than join a gang. Whereas it was pretty common in those days to be part of a gang. Yeah, so yeah, Aokang pretty lawless place back in the day. So yeah, we are not intending to also go back to those days. All right. So what happens is that if there are no further questions, okay, maybe we'll invite Robert and Eric to make their final remarks, wrap up their thoughts for the day. It's been an interesting discussion. We've covered quite a lot of material and we've expanded way beyond our remit. We even cover tigers and gangsters. Okay, so maybe we can start with Eric, then Robert, and then after that, I will just close. How about that?
Right, so the Teo brothers are an indispensable link in Singapore's literary history. Early in the 20th century, there were poems and short stories published in the the Settlements Chinese Review, an annual, that probably contributed to the later flourishing of Singapore literature. But between the writers then and perhaps later poets from Professor Wang Gungwu's time. So we had the Teos in the 1930s. So they were indispensable, and Teo Kah Leng in a lot of ways is he Singapore's only war poet? Because it's a rather strange and amazing thing that so Singapore was ravaged by the Japanese during their occupation, but there are very few poems that were written about that period.
Mm.
And even Teo Kah Leng's book was published only in 2016, right? So Some people say that Singapore didn't suffer enough during the occupation, or perhaps the people were so numbed by the atrocities of Sukching that they really didn't want to talk about it. They were speechless. That's all. Robert.
Yes, Eric, you made a good point about the war poems. I think if you look at, in particular, Teo Kah Leng,
Yes.
the 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 two brothers.
Yes.
Of course, Teo Poh Leng is I would say that he's written when he wrote the poem F.M.S.R. He wrote
Yes.
probably our first modernist poem.
Yes.
But his brother, I think, might have seen himself playing second fiddle to his more modernist brother,
Yes.
because he complained that he couldn't get his poems published, if
Yeah.
you recall, because by his own perception, he favored a language which tended, in some ways, to be, how shall we put it, imitative.
Mm.
His poetic diction, his language would use inversions which were not considered modernist at that time. I mean, after T.S. Eliot had published The Wasteland in 1922, you couldn't write poetry anymore in which you talk about city fair. You got to talk about fair city.
Mhm.
Free verse became fashionable, and regular verse became unfashionable. And Kah Leng liked to write ballads and use traditional rhythms and iambic rhythms, um, and so on. And so he found that he was not able to publish. But when you look at his book, I Found a Poem and Other Poems, I think he made a contribution to the evolving literature in English by doing a couple of things which I consider important. That although his language may be imitative and is what's called poetic diction, what he did was to use local myths and local diction. He would bring words like sampan and merba, or local words, into his verse, although they are traditional. And he would also uh, use myths, some of which are local and Malay. I'm looking at uh, the book I Found a Bone, and I'm looking at poems like The Woodpecker, A Chinese Wayang, Ronggeng, To the Sakai. So you see, he was aware that although his diction may seem a little bit uh, weak, romantic, he brought into his poetry local themes, and that's very important. We need to write about our own people, our own flora and fauna, and I think he was important for what he did. It is a pity that he felt he wasn't modern enough to be published. I just want to make one last remark that Kah Leng lived to a ripe old age till the year 2000. And if I had known that he was alive when I was writing, I would have looked him up. But I didn't know he existed. So that is one thing that I must have missed, then didn't know that I missed. So I think I will stop there. That would be my among my last words on the subject today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert and Eric. Thank you for taking the time to come down, and thank you, World Scientific, for organizing this event. And thank you to everyone who came by today to listen to this talk. So before we end, one last pitch. If you want to find out more, like Robert says, about local literary pioneers or local history and local heritage in particular, do consider supporting our book. It will make a wonderful Christmas gift. Christmas is coming up soon. And please buy 5 copies each. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of the day ahead. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful
Bye-bye.
session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Robert. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar as much as we did. Have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you again for our next webinar. Thank you. Bye.